Four things I'm going to talk about today. He says, hopefully, that the slide moves on. Yes, they are. First of all, about me. I know some of you, but I don't know all of you, and therefore can assume that not everybody knows what I do and what I'm about. In terms of my research, goodness, this is working very slowly. There we are. It's a bit of an odd mix, a bit yin and yang. On one half, I research poverty, and that takes up the most of my time in terms of my research. But I've also, for a long time, researched children's play. So I can a more positive and a more negative part of children's lives. And there's a fusion between the two. There's always a desire for me to look at the overlap between the two, the play aspects that relate to poverty, the poverty aspects that relate to play. So I'm a mix of interest in terms of poverty and play. In terms of my background, then, I've always lived in areas that are, except once where I lived in Troon for a few years. I've always lived in parts of Scotland that are considered to be amongst the most deprived parts of Scotland. These four maps in front of you are the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. The darker the red, the more deprived the area. I'm currently living down in the bottom corner here, in a wee village called Plains, and it's considered then that where I live just now is in one of Scotland's 10% most deprived areas. Now, I'm not deprived. I've been fortunate throughout my life to have had opportunities from within the family and the broader communities. And I think that tells us something that we need to be careful about when we're trying to make sense of poverty information, poverty data. But I'm very much aware in an everyday sense of the challenges that many people face, even if I personally don't encounter them. And I'm an optimist. In terms of what we can do in terms of tackling poverty, I think there are some that don't see poverty as a problem. It's just always going to be there. If we think it's a problem, some of us blame people for that poverty that they experience. Others, way in the other end of the spectrum, blame the system. It's some abstract hidden hand that's keeping people down. I tend to take a more middle of the road perspective in that I think we've got resources and we're not doing the right things with them. And if we did do the right things with them, we could make a difference. And while that might be negative in terms of saying we could do better, I tend to see that as a vision of an optimist, because I think if we do better, we can make a difference. That's very much my perspective on things. So the impossible task was to summarise one piece of research in 1 minute. And I've cheated a wee bit, but I don't mind that. I think I can get away with it. Here we go. That one bit of work I'm going to refer to is a book that's just coming out just now that I co-edit with a number of colleagues. So it's not my own work, it's a collaborative effort. Published by the Child Poverty Action Group. This iteration will be published in April the 26th, I think, the end of April. We always publish this in the year of a Scottish parliamentary election, because the idea is to get people talking about poverty at the time where either policies have been formed, if we publish the book earlier, or people are debating the issues about what Scotland should be. It's a collaborative effort. It's data rich in the first half, but it's also issue rich in the latter half. There's an essay in there that's written by Kay Sillers of Unison on childcare. And as I say, this is a series that we've done every Scottish parliamentary election. We published this book, and childcare in the early years has been a feature through time that we've consistently had a chapter in the back end of the book, because the back end of the book's about experts. It's not just about academics and researchers. It's about people that are at the front line delivering services or designing services, what they think the priorities are for their area. And there are 15 of the essays in this year's book, I say one of which specifically looks at childcare. So why does this broad issue of poverty, why does it matter to those working with young children? And there's two parts that follow here. First of all, it's those working with young children. And secondly is why should it matter to young children themselves? And of course, that's ultimately what it's about. It's about the last set of slides that I'm going to put up. How is it that we can do things differently that will make a difference to young people's lives? But beforehand, we have to think about why those that work with young children should be interested in this issue. Of course, it's a good day to be talking about this in terms of what's happening at the Scottish Parliament today, what that should do in terms of ratcheting issues such as this up the agenda. But for now, the kind of downside is that it's a significant problem in Scotland. It's estimated, not quite 250,000, but not far off it, children in Scotland currently living in poverty. And the vast majority of these children living in families with some work. I think that's really important to get across. The vast majority of children find themselves living in a household when at least one of the adults in their household is at least some form of work. Not a good picture. So we don't start in a good place. So you should be bothered about it because you're interested in children's lives in the round, and this is a significant issue that affects many children in Scotland. More than 1 in 5, slightly less than 1 in 4. I think it's also significant for the early years in particular because there's a higher risk of poverty amongst children who are younger. Now, these are the 6 priority groups for the Child Poverty Act, Scotland's Every Child, Every Chance, because as I'm sure you're aware, Scotland has committed itself, has legislated to eradicate child poverty by 2030. And these are the 6 groups that are a higher risk of poverty than other groups within the population. And one of them, the youngest child aged under 1, 1/3 of children aged under 1 are living in relative poverty. I think also significant here, if we think about, beyond children aged under 1, if we think of the early years more generally, is that young mothers aged under 25, 44%, and just take a note of that number, 44% of children who are living in a household with a young mother aged under 25 are living in poverty. And quite reasonably, we would expect that a significant proportion of those children are in the early years. So while there's no direct evidence that talks about all the early years in terms of the priority groups, we can reasonably surmise that there's a higher risk of poverty amongst the children that we're interested in. It's a bad enough situation for children as a whole. It's particularly acute for children in the early years. That's why, another reason why we should bother about it. And the government get it. I mean, this is how they envision the framework that local areas as well as the nation should be working to eradicate child poverty. And I draw your attention to that, box at the bottom there. The availability of affordable and accessible transport and childcare is understood by Scottish Government to be one of the drivers that can lead to transformative change for children. So the thinking is, if we get childcare right, it will enable families to be better placed to earn more income from employment. Or if we can get childcare right, it will be reducing the cost of living for families by making the pounds that they have stretch a little further. So it's not just a case of, you should think about it. The Scottish Government thinks that you should think about it. It sees that childcare then is one of the key planks that has to be right. I know childcare is not quite the same as play. It's not quite the same as everything the early years are. But in terms of what the government are interested in, childcare is something for us to consider. More complex graph here and slightly more problematic. And I think there's a role for all professionals that work with children to kind of be aware of this in the background. This is what the British Social Attitude Survey tell us about what people, in this case Scotland, think of the reasons for child poverty. The blue part of the graph is a proportion that think it's the very most important reason for child poverty. And the additional red portion of the graph is if you take the most important and just makes a contribution, that's the total population that think that makes a contribution. So if we take the top line, 21% of people in Scotland think the main cause of poverty, child poverty in Scotland, is the addictions and abuse of the parents. And together with the other 61%, that's telling us that 82% of people in Scotland think that makes a contribution to child poverty. So a contribution or the very most important contribution. And that's kind of not the reality. And that's the point to make, that, the broader public, albeit we like to see ourselves as understanding, we like to occasionally position ourselves differently from England and say that England don't understand it. We're a country that, looks out for each other. We've got a different view of the way the world works. The reality is not always the same. We're not that different from people down south when it comes to understanding poverty. And there's a lot of misunderstanding, blaming people for the circumstances in which they find themselves. Whereas if we look at the reality of it, there are more structural reasons that are more important. I mean, if you think about it logically, is it reasonable to think that 230,000 children in our country are largely experiencing poverty because their parents are and experiencing addictions or substance abuse? It just is illogical if you look at it in that way. So we don't understand, I think, is the point. So when we are thinking about anti-poverty actions as an early years sector, there's a bit of hearts and minds to be won over as well. Some are on board, but not all, and I think we have to acknowledge that. I think this is a little bit older now. This information isn't routinely collected. It's something we did for the STV Children's Appeal a few years ago, where we kind of tried to better understand what people in Scotland thought about poverty. And we're asking who's got a role to tackle it. And I think what was interesting about this is how low down the graph, and it's not just Scotland, this holds in other parts of the UK too, voluntary organisations and local businesses are. Voluntary organisations, only 1 in 3 people thought that they had a role to play in tackling poverty, and 1 in 5 for local businesses having a role to play in tackling poverty. I think we need to get to the mindset where all of these bars are 100%, that people realise that everybody's got a role and a responsibility for tackling poverty. Yes, we might argue that the national government has got more of a responsibility than others, but I think everybody's got a role they can play, either in terms of tackling the poverty for families that they are serving, or indeed making sure that their employees are not themselves living in poverty and there's not in-work poverty within the sector, which of course is a really significant issue and something that I think we'll have to grapple with if we do manage to deliver what we want to deliver in terms of childcare as a nation. We need to make sure that we're not creating a new cadre of in-work poor amongst the childcare sector, something that Kay Sillars talks about in her chapter in the book. And that's, I think, an important issue for the early years sector to think about is what is its contribution towards tackling poverty in Scotland. And I think it's both short-term and long-term. It's short-term in the sense of maybe enabling parents to be better placed to engage the labour market, which in turn would make parents better placed to enable themselves to leave poverty, and perhaps also by stretching the money that they have to spend and therefore reducing the burden. So there are short-term implications which are good, but I think there's a long-term issues too about enabling children, allowing children to not be far behind when they start school, because we know when they come into the early years there's already a gap, and that gap unfortunately stretches a little in the early years and then continues to stretch through school years. So we've got a role to play there, I think, in the longer term, about setting the foundations right, which can enable children in the longer term as they approach their adult life and move through childhood to get the most of opportunities. And, you know, I like this. This is the school sector are very good at, you know, thinking about what they have to do as a sector. And on Friday of this week, the EIS union launches its PACT project, a professional training programme for teachers to get them to think about what they should do as practitioners to tackle poverty, building in a lot of work they've done over the years. I think there's a case for the early years sector to do something similar, you know, to think about sharing it amongst practitioners. This is what we as a sector could do. These are examples of good practice. And all different manner of people that work in all different types of early year settings, thinking about the actions that we can take to make a difference. So why does this matter to young children? And that's why it should matter to us as those that are designing and providing the services. Why should it matter to young children? I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I think the point I would make is that poverty can have lots of different impacts in children, and it might have no impact whatsoever. But an important point to make there is not to say that it's not important. Poverty doesn't always have an impact in children because of the work that people like yourselves do, because of the interventions you're making that take the edge off that poverty, that provide that social protection, that allow opportunities, to allow talent to flourish. So poverty need not have an impact in children, family poverty, because we have a framework in place of support and opportunity that allows children to realise their talents. Now, you might argue that that's a bit, I don't know, short-termist in a way. We don't deal with the fundamentals. What we're dealing with the problems as they present. But I think it's really important that we deal with the problems as they present. And I see a key role for the sector then in making sure that poverty doesn't impact on children, not necessarily eradicating poverty, but the key objective being in making lives better for those children that experience poverty. Just a few issues as we move toward discussion, maybe to try to open it up. We know about free lunches are now going to be extended into the early years setting, and we now know, in fact, it looks as if they're going to be extended into the upper years of primary school too. Just a word of caution, in that just now not all free lunches are consumed by children who are entitled to them, and there are many reasons for this, and I think it's something that we need to think about as a sector. If we believe then that providing nourishing food is really important to children, it's not working in every primary school just now. And here's just a few select examples of schools in Aberdeen, primary schools in Aberdeen, where the uptake of children who are in attendance and entitled to free school meals is actually quite low. And I've picked, if you like, in the authorities in the north, it'd be the same in every authority. There are schools where uptake is very low. So I think that's something we've got to be mindful of as a sector. This wonderful opportunity to nourish our children, you know, it won't just happen. You know, we've got to get a lot of things in place to make sure that ask is realised. And the very last point I want to make, because I've talked about what we have to do as a sector, is of course giving children a responsibility and a role as well. This slide there's got nothing to do with child poverty. It was a lovely story from a couple of years ago, where children outside their school were giving fake parking tickets to the parents who were parking outside the school and making the journey to school more hazardous than it need be. I think a nice example of children, okay, with a little bit of support from the head teacher there, taking action to do something to improve the quality of their lives and asking difficult questions to the parents round about them. And I think even in the early years, as you know, there are ways in which we have to engage young people from the very earliest years. And I think it's not just about adults doing something to tackle child poverty. We also need to think about listening to that experience and how to do that effectively as well. Not my expertise for the very youngest age group, but I still think it's both a point of principle if we think about what's going through the Scottish Parliament today, but also in terms of good practice, something that we have to think through too.